Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Dementia Researcher Salon debate, the second to last in our debate series and the last serious debate of 2025. I'm Adam Smith, I'm the Programme Director for Dementia Researcher, and I'll be your host for the next hour. Thank you very much for joining us here in the Dementia Researcher community. So tonight's motion explores the purpose and expectations of postdoctoral training. And the statement is, this House would make teaching experience mandatory for all postdoctoral researchers. So some believe that teaching is an essential skill that strengthens communication and broadens career prospects and enriches the academic community, while others argue that mandatory teaching risks overburdening researchers, reducing time for publications, and forcing people into activities that don't align with their goals or that they're not very good at. So should teaching be encouraged as part of your postdoc work, or should it remain optional? Speaking for the motion this evening, we have Sara Zsadanyi, who is a PhD student at the Sant Pau Memory Unit and the Neuroimaging Court and University Autonoma of Barcelona. And I've butchered the name of where you work, but there's Sara. Hi, Sara. Originally from New Zealand and there right now, early in the morning. She moved to Barcelona to undertake her PhD, and her work focuses on neuroimaging of small vessel disease in Down syndrome and autosomal dominant Alzheimer's. Hi, Sara. Thank you very much for joining us again in the salon.
Good morning.
And speaking against the motion, we're joined by the newly minted, my entire intro for you is now wrong because I thought you were still the newly minted Dr. Rachel Allen, who has just passed her Viva. Congratulations, Rachel. And started a new job and moved house. So we're very grateful for you giving up your evening tonight because I know it's busy time of year for you. So Rachel's work, don't know if it still does, we'll find out, explores career development of people with young onset dementia and examining how work, identity and disability interact. Is there an update to that, Rachel? You have a new job now, I assume.
Yes. So I'm currently a research fellow at the Working with Dementia Network Plus at the University of the West of Scotland. So our research is focused on helping those affected by dementia in employment. So it's still very much in that kind of space.
Brilliant. And a really underexplored topic, because one assumes, oh, just because you've got dementia, that's it, going to quit work. But people have got many years of working life still in them for many people. So well done for looking at that. So if you're new to the Dementia Researcher debate salons, let me explain the format to you briefly. We start by having 10 minutes of introductions where Sara will go first, Rich will follow up, and they'll have 10 minutes each to make their case for why they are for or against the House's motion. Then we'll have some time for rebuttal, we'll have some discussion, there'll be a chance for you to ask your own questions or make your own points if you have feelings on this topic, and then we'll finish with some closing statements. But we start every one of these debates by asking the audience to do a little straw poll to see where you sit, what your view is at the start of this. So if you check the Q&A right now, I know this is going to be, sorry, not the Q&A, the comments section. There is a link. I know clicking that link will send you away and you'll have to come back again, but please do click the link and tell us what you think at the start. So how do you vote at the moment? This House would make teaching experience mandatory for all postdoc researchers. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Or are you undecided? So go ahead now, vote in our starting poll, and then at the very end we're going to poll you again to see if your opinions have been swayed one way or another by our brilliant debates, arguments from Rachel and Sara. So where do we stand right now? I'll give you 10 seconds to do that, and I'm going to share my screen in real time so we can see where opinions lie. So there we go. 4 votes in our pre-poll, 75%. Oh, look at that. It's entirely split. Almost. So nearly half of our audience this evening are undecided. Somebody agrees and somebody disagrees. So all to play for, I feel, this evening. Good arguments either way could swing the voting. But that's enough from me. I'm going to start by shutting up and handing over to Sara. Sara, your 10 minutes starts now.
Thanks, Adam. So I feel that I do have quite a strong opinion on this one, actually. And it comes from just quite a few years now of having different mentors and supervisors in my life, inside of academia and outside of academia. I think that in terms of being a postdoctoral researcher, all of us, once we reach this stage, and I haven't reached this stage personally, but all of us will have to do something related to teaching. And we might not give it the word teaching. We might call it supervising a master's student or supervising a PhD student. Or we might actually be in a role that specifically says, yes, we are a teacher in a university, in an institution. And so I think that for many, especially with this model of publish or perish that we sort of still live within in the academic world, there will be quite a bit of teaching, explicit or implicit, that we have to do to ensure that we can do the research that we want to do, and that we have a team around us who can help us to reach the goal of doing this research. So one of my main arguments about this, and Adam has already touched on this morning or this evening, if you're seeing this from any part of the world that's not my part of the world, is that communication is such a huge part of research and a huge part of scientific impact. And it's not just about the research output that we do, because it's wonderful that we can write an article, send it to a journal, and have other academics read it that way. But to get our research out to the widest possible audience, as we all know, going to things like conferences, giving talks to patients and their families, communication is such a big part of what we do, in my opinion, and is very important for making sure that the research actually gets to the people that we want to get our research to. And so I think one of the best ways to hone in on this skill of communicating our research is actually to do it through teaching, which is kind of like having a built-in communication training that you have to do in order to get a student on board, get them to do research or to learn from what you have learned in your research. I do think that the communication parts of things is very important for our posters and our oral presentations, but having students is a very different sort of modality, and it's a lot more, you have to fine tune the way that you're communicating your research. And so I think that this is sort of a case of being able to deepen our mastery of the topic that we've chosen to do our research in as well. And people sometimes talk about the Feynman technique. Being able to really understand the topic often comes from being able to teach it either to yourself or to a student, and then have that feedback loop of seeing how well did I teach this topic, how well did I understand it, so that I could convey it to another person afterwards. And then you get the feedback from the student if they have understood the way that you've explained things, if there are better ways that you can explain these much more difficult topics, to then go on and explain it to other audiences and other students. And I also think that sort of the reason why I think it's important to make it mandatory, make sure that all postdocs, not just the ones who are really motivated to teach, are able to actually develop the leadership and the communication skills that they need for a whole bunch of different careers that you can find in academia, and also outside of academia. Because in reality, many postdocs do go on to continue in research, but some might find that after doing one or two postdocs, that they're ready to leave academia and go on to a different role. And so I think always having these skills of teaching, of communication, and of leadership always looks wonderful when you're applying for any kind of job, especially within academia. And so being able to really use these skills to our advantage if we are considering our career in the future. And then I think my last real point on this is that, to put it scientifically, this is a double whammy. The students that we have who are coming into universities or coming into research settings will benefit from having these mentors and these teachers who are active researchers themselves. So it's very wonderful that we, as people who are doing the research and are very connected to the literature, to what's going on in the research world, are teaching these students. And then on the other hand, we as the postdocs will benefit from having this real classroom experience and this ability to teach and to learn how to communicate our research. So I think, I could anticipate that there'll be some arguments against this. And one sort of caveat that I think comes with this idea of having mandatory teaching in a postdoc position is that if universities or these research institutes are requiring teaching to be done by all postdocs, then they also have to have the responsibility to train postdocs properly to be able to do this teaching. And I think for now, that is my argument. I'm very interested to hear what Dr. Rachel Allen has to say.
Very much. Thank you very much, Sarah. You and well within your time. So thank you very much, Sara, for making the point there. And Rachel, we're going to hand over to you now to argue why you think the other side of this debate.
Great, thanks, Adam, and thank you, Sara. You raised so many interesting, really good points, and I think your first point really around kind of defining what teaching is, I think is really important. So I've kind of taken a traditional view with the points that I've noted, but I definitely think it's a really interesting point that you raise in that kind of that mentoring and supervision and even guidance to others. Is that teaching? And if so, how do we kind of measure that or kind of stipulate it or quantify it? It's a really interesting kind of point. And I suppose my counter, I kind of have 3 points that I've prepared. And I think, firstly, the postdoc is enough. I started my current research fellow role before submitting my thesis and doing the viva. And you need the time, I think, to mentally and physically regroup after the rigors of a PhD. So when you're then going into your postdoc, and I'm speaking from my personal experience, and I know that other people may well be very different, but you're exhausted and your head is full. So to then be taking that exhausted self into the classroom straight away before you've had actually a chance to regroup and find yourself again a little bit, I think might be quite a difficult one. And I think when we think about what a postdoc is, the essentials that are part of that you need to do the role successfully. And by success, I mean being able to take advantage of all the opportunities that presents, both implicit and explicit, being able to have balance with your workload and the other life stuff that's important, particularly if you've had to neglect that during your PhD studies and you need that time again with family and with home and to have a holiday and all these other things. To add anything extra onto that postdoc that doesn't need to be there, I think is doing a disservice. And making something mandatory that isn't necessary is then adding a pressure onto something that's already pressured. So the postdoc is enough, I think, would be my first point. It's great to have that teaching experience if that aligns with your career goals or your development needs. But it'd be wrong to assume, I think, that would be useful and beneficial for all postdocs. And if it's not useful and beneficial for all, then why is it mandatory for all? And I think that kind of leads to my second point, is that not all postdocs are the same. And therefore making teaching experience mandatory would kind of ignore how diverse the PGR and ECR community is. I mean, from personal experience, I'm in my mid-40s, and when I started the PhD, I was working as a senior teaching assistant at a local school. I was teaching English online. I was a qualified adult education tutor. I had teaching experience, just not in a university context. And through the PhD, I developed a real love for research, and that's the direction that my professional life is evolving in. So I had teaching experience in different contexts before the PhD, and I think a lot of postdocs will have that previous life experience that they brought with them into academia, and to then make something mandatory for everybody would kind of not kind of take into account the diversity of experience that people do bring when they come into academia from that wider life. And I'd also kind of argue that teaching and communication are different, that they are linked, but that teaching is not the only way, or perhaps even the most desirable way, to refine and practice those communication skills. But I do agree with Sara's point that it's a great way of being able to practice those communication skills, particularly with that reflection and thinking about the different needs that students have and the different ways that you have to kind of communicate something. But I do think that teaching is a specific skill in and of itself, and it's part of that wider communication skills. But is it the only way of being able to help people to develop that when they need that? I think it's also important to consider, I need adjustments to my role because of my health condition. So I work part-time, I have restrictions on travel and things like that. So if we're putting mandatory teaching requirements in, are we then restricting the diversity of the postdoc community? So people, for example, who've got caring responsibilities, people who are less able to travel, working remotely, things like that. How are they going to be able to successfully manage this additional requirement when they're already managing the requirements of the postdoc? And I think we want a research community where anyone, regardless of background or circumstances, is enabled to flourish, not having more barriers to be able to do that. And I think something like a mandatory teaching requirement runs the risk of perhaps doing that unintentionally. And I think just to sort of come around to my third point is the simple fact is there are just not enough teaching and lecturing jobs as it is. Those jobs just don't exist. So I wonder how we would manage the practicalities of that. Would it basically be wasting time to sort of give postdocs this teaching experience when perhaps that isn't going to lead to further career development in that sphere, if that's just not a realistic job prospect? And Sara made a really good point about that really being of benefit on the CV, and that's absolutely right. But if it's not where you want to go, or it's not where the jobs are, how useful is that benefit on your CV? Are there other things that you could have done or could be doing that would also be beneficial on your CV and also be more helpful with perhaps securing a job? And I think part of the postdoc is developing your identity as a researcher and working out what you want your next opportunities to look like. And so if we're sending the message that teaching experience is mandatory, we're kind of communicating an expectation that this is what you're going to do. And of course, there are lots of different kinds of postdocs out there that may or may not include teaching. And I think academia can already kind of be you know, quite alienating for a lot of people. We don't want to then have more alienation when it gets to the postdoc stage for people for whom that just is interesting or just not something that they need or want. So yeah, I think I found an article in Nature by Kwon from June 2025 that 2/3 of PhDs are employed outside of academia, that the number of PhDs compared with academic jobs, there's not a balance there. The majority of people getting a PhD, there just aren't the jobs in academia. And when those jobs are there, they're often precarious. They can be full-time, so people having to have jobs to supplement income, and then adding teaching onto that is just going to make that unsustainable. And people are on short-term contracts, they're having to move. So where does that leave students? If you're on a short-term contract and then you've got to build in that lesson planning and the assessment, somebody's got to train the postdocs in their teaching and assess that and give them feedback. And I think a lot of university staff are completely sort of, you know, snowed under as it is without adding extra responsibility. So how would we kind of manage that? So I think maybe this debate is quite important in terms of a wider discussion. You know, could universities be doing more outreach, working more with schools, for example, and that might be a way of developing those communication skills outside of that academic context, because that may well be useful for postdocs when they're thinking about the next steps afterwards. So I think those are the main points. So hopefully I haven't garbled too much.
Not at all. That was perfect. Thank you. So Sara, would you like to respond to the comment? Oh, sorry, I didn't realize my camera wasn't on. Sara, would you like to respond to Rachel's points? If you'd like to do some rebuttal.
Yeah, sure. Honestly, I come here feeling like it's a bit difficult to have a rebuttal to your points. I think it's very, very interesting that you brought up sort of some more wider systemic issues that we do have in academia that would cause some barriers actually for people to do teaching. And I do completely agree with everything that you said on this. I think this is a bit, so as is the nature of debates, it's quite a black or white question to say whether teaching should be mandatory, and that word mandatory for all postdocs, I think it is quite a harsh stance, quite a hard one to defend. And I think that's the case actually with a lot of things that happen in academia, that to make it mandatory for us to, you know, have a certain amount of research output to be considered for tenure, all these sorts of things, it's very difficult to prescribe something like that to an entire community of researchers without taking into account that they may have children, they may have caring that they have to do, they may have health issues as well that they have to deal with on the side. I think it's also hard for me to rebut because I'm not a postdoc. So I'm not exhausted post PhD, although I can see that I will be very shortly. And I think that one quite important point that you brought up was that, firstly, that teaching and communication aren't necessarily, that teaching is not the only way that we can teach communication. And I definitely agree with that. I think that teaching is one of the best ways of developing communication skills. And I say that as someone who has also done some teaching in different settings. I think that it would be interesting to, if we were to sort of make this mandatory, that it would be interesting to not just limit teaching to the formal sit down in the university classroom, listen to me speak for 3 hours about this topic so that you can write an exam. And I think that it should be maybe a something where we think about communicating to many different audiences, taking it outside of academia, because we do have our little bubble of academics talking with one another, but it would be very interesting to see if the teaching requirements were broader. So if it could have more to do with teaching in classrooms with younger children, or having seminars for patients or their families, so that we could actually bring the research out into the wider world. And that might sort of help as well with this issue that we have with how there are not enough jobs in teaching and lecturing available, and could also sort of open it up so that it's not that we're teaching for 6 hours a week or 10 hours a week mandatory, but instead that we would be getting involved in some sort of teaching and outreach and communication that would be spread out throughout the year, say, and in many different settings. But yeah, that's all I really have to say on that. You had a very, very, very convincing point, and I really appreciate that you brought up this topic of putting a lot of pressure on academics who are really overwrought and have their own lives outside of academia.
Thank you very much, Sara. Rachel, your rebuttal.
Yeah, I mean, I think both Sara and I are in agreement. We need a definition of what teaching is that is beyond the traditional kind of, I mean, even we live in like this modern world that, I'm increasingly not understanding, where people are just not sat in a lecture theatre listening for 3 hours and then going home, hybrid ways of working, doing lessons online, doing, lessons in the middle of the night. People are working in all kinds of different ways, and academia kind of has to adjust and to keep up. And perhaps postdocs are kind of an ideal way of sort of stretching those boundaries and experimenting a little bit with what works, because you can't just keep doing the same old, and universities can sometimes not be the quickest in kind of adapting to what their students' needs might be as that technology and those ways of working evolve. So I definitely think that we agree that wider definition of teaching kind of needs to be kind of thought about. And I think as well, I mean, it's certainly perhaps true in schools, and my impression from those I know who are working in teaching roles in academia is it's probably true in academia as well. But a lot of teaching is admin. And if you've got through the PhD process, you can do admin. You can do the lesson planning and the student records and the assessment recording and all that kind of extra stuff. So we think of the teaching as the time spent in front of the students, but actually, a huge amount of work goes either side of that. And I'm just wondering, is that really beneficial? Does that really benefit communication skills, given the skills you will have developed during the PhD and the other parts of your postdoc? So I think we need to kind of consider that as well when we think about what teaching is, because a lot of it is the background stuff that the students may not see or appreciate, and things. And yeah, so I think Sara and I are quite in agreement. We're not going to have any fights.
Can I ask you both to disagree very strongly now? And you're not supposed to agree quite so much. No, I'm kidding. As ever with all these things, there's never kind of it's always slightly more nuanced, isn't it? And you're quite right. I mean, to make that point, the first thing is what should we define as teaching? Are we, is teaching simply being a mentor to young students? Is it kind of, a mandatory part of the thing? I mean, do you have to teach a class once a week on a certain topic as part of your contract? Is that taking away from professional teachers. Rachel, you made a point before that you thought teaching, or correct me if I missed your point, that you think teaching should be left to teachers, that fundamentally that lecturing university students, whether that's at the undergrad or postgrad stage, that responsibility for delivering that should be expert professional teachers whose full-time job it is to do that task, and researchers should stick to research. Is that?
Well, I don't think I put it that bluntly, Adam, I hope. But I suppose to answer that, and I don't think I would perhaps put it that kind of, talking about things being a black and white issue. I don't think it's quite that clear cut. But I suppose where I'm coming from with that is one of the jobs I had before PhD life was I worked as a cover supervisor at a secondary school. And it was a very different job, kind of supervising the class for an hour, than it was actually teaching and actually imparting wisdom and knowledge to these young people. And you kind of realize what a skill actually being able to teach is, not just explain, not just describe, not just communicate, but actually teach, to instill those skills of evaluation and decision making and understanding to the people you're trying to teach. So I think it's perhaps an undervalued skill, I suppose, is what I was trying to say, and that we can't assume that all postdocs are necessarily going to have that skill or even be able to develop it to a point where it's at university level. That doesn't take away from the other skill sets that they may have. But I think we all as researchers have our strengths and our weaknesses. And I think if we sort of assume that if teaching is mandatory for all postdocs, then we're kind of implying that all postdocs have that teaching skill.
Yeah,
and
you make
that
a
can take a lot
point.
of time and a lot of input to actually develop. So I suppose that's where I was coming from with that.
I mean, you make a good point. I can't imagine. I mean, both of you obviously have done a PhD. When you were going through the process, did you want to be somebody who does teaching, or did you want to be somebody that did science or did research or did the discovery part? Was teaching something you wanted to do, either of you? Sara?
Yes.
You did.
Yes, for sure.
But I'm guessing that there will be those who never wanted to do that. The idea of standing in front of a classroom or in front of a lecture theatre and delivering a lecture on or a guide on how to do that would absolutely scare the hell out of them and would not be something. There's a lot of introvert academics out there, right? But if you knew from the outset that what you were getting into, if we change culture, this isn't going to happen. Obviously, we don't want to suddenly say to PhD students, by the way, when you're a postdoc, now you've got to be part of teaching. But if we changed in some parts of the world, for example, other parts of the world, there is an expectation that everybody from research fellow onwards will have to deliver teaching so many sessions a week. And it just comes with the job. And if you don't want that, well, then you have to negotiate that out of your contract. But by default, it's in the contract. So Sara, if teaching did become mandatory, do you think there should be quality standards? Do we risk putting poor teachers in front of people that just didn't want to be there, didn't want to do it, but they're forced to do it? What do you think? How will we maintain quality?
Absolutely don't want to have poor quality teaching going into the system, of course. I think probably all of us here have had our fair share of good teachers, or not good teachers, very inspiring teachers, and some less inspired, less interested, kind of just doing it because they have to, teachers. I do think that this kind of varies culturally depending on the country, and I think I've had quite a bit of experience with different cultures and different countries and how they do sort of bake teaching into sort of the entire university experience. because I know the university here in Auckland, they do have a lot of teaching assistant positions that start from sort of the postgraduate level onwards. And I think maybe one sort of consideration that we could have when doing something like this is that if you sort of require a postdoc to just suddenly start teaching after perhaps doing, 8 to 10 years of university with no teaching, just being lectured at, that could maybe be a bit harsh. And one thing that I really appreciated during my postdoc, my PhD time, sorry, getting ahead of myself, is that my supervisor spoke with us at the beginning of the PhD and said, well, one thing that I would really like you guys to do is to start doing some supervision. And so that's a very Spanish model. I'm not so sure. I know that in Australia, for example, you have to do quite a bit of being supervised by a supervisor before you can supervise on your own. And there are some requirements for sort of professional development that you have to do before you can get a role like that. But I think it differs quite a bit across the world at the moment. And the system that I sort of have appreciated the most is maybe this Australian system of slowly transitioning people into teaching roles. And you can then make the decision and say, look, teaching's not for me. And I think I have had that experience of realizing that maybe teaching was not something that I was so interested in. And having this scaffolded in my first year, helping to supervise a master's student, in my second year being a more active supervisor. I think that was quite helpful for helping me develop the skills slowly without a whole lot of pressure of like, you are responsible for making sure that these students do really well. And then sort of maybe giving more of a choice of whether people would like to continue in a role that does include teaching or doesn't include teaching. So that having quality standards is very important. And if you are responsible for students learning, I think that quality and standards should always be in place for that as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. And do you think, do you think there's something to be said here for researchers? Depends on what topic we're talking about, right? I suppose. But I think you can't help but think that you're better off potentially getting a lesson from somebody on a certain topic, from somebody who does this day in, day out. And it's, if you're in a wet lab, for example, that some of that teaching is going to be actually in the lab or not just in a lecture theatre, that ought to be delivered by people who do this day in, day out, not somebody who qualified as a lecturer 3 years ago. Of course, I'm sure they're all very professional and they maintain their skills and everything else, but they're not in the day-to-day practice in the same way anymore. And so I don't know, Rachel, what do you think? Are there certain things that actually would be better taught by people who are doing that on the job, not people who are maybe slightly removed from it?
It's a really good point, Adam, and I think it is looking at that diversity perspective from a different angle, because postdocs are just incredibly diverse in, what the point of the role is, how long it's for, how it's funded, how many hours a week it is. Not all postdocs, are the same. And I think, there are areas in science where if you are doing that day to day in the lab and then going and teaching it, that's obviously useful. And there are other areas of science where perhaps, you did it for 20 years and now you're focusing on teaching the next generation of scientists, to do that in a different way, but you're instilling the skills that you used in your career before. So I think that there's different contexts. to it. And I think, you know, I mean, if I went for a postdoc role in a lab, I mean, I wouldn't get it. Let's just be completely frank about it. But I mean, if I was in a lab, I would be useless. I wouldn't have a clue. I would be awful. Put me in a social science qualitative space, and that's where my skill set is. Put me in a classroom, and, you know, maybe I'd be brilliant. Maybe I would be, you know, like I would in a lab, and not so brilliant. So I think we just need to appreciate that diversity and be able to kind of perhaps celebrate it and utilize that different postdocs can offer you different things. If we're going to have this precarious academic situation of short-term contracts, let's at least let people build into those contracts what they want to do and what they would find useful and what they're interested in, how they want to develop, rather than sort of saying, yeah, teaching's part of all of them.
It often, I don't know if you agree, it often seems to be the case that some of the people I know recently who have gone into lecturing, it's not necessarily because that's what they wanted to do. However, lecturer jobs aren't necessarily, although it's a very changing situation in the UK, but they're not short-term contracts in the same way. That if you get a lectureship, quite often it might there's a more flexibility in that, in so much as you might be able to get some protected research time, but they tend to be more substantive contracts than they do research jobs, which are funding dependent, short-term, 12 to 18 months. And so it's not necessarily that they even wanted to become lecturers, but that's where they could get a job. That's where it gave them some permanence, that they didn't have to be fighting for funding all the time, but with some research time. So if they did want to do research, they could. So it's almost like the inverse of that, right? You almost want kind of a permanent researcher job where you can buy out some of your time for teaching. Do you think if teaching became mandatory, funders would stand for that? Who's going to pay for that time? Because of course, research, you know, if it suddenly becomes mandatory, I guess are we thinking here that then there just have to be a new model for how contracts are done? I mean, this happens already, right? People teach, but when you buy out your time, when you write a grant and you say, I want so much of my time to be funded, do you think we could persuade research funders to buy into this and say, hey, well, we'll fund your teaching time? Do you think they'd go for it? So I think Rachel, I think both of us, all of us are saying, no, they wouldn't, would they?
I mean,
that's what the university.
The thing kind of is, though, as well, is that I think probably in all of our working contexts, there's a difference between the theory and the practice. So when a contract says X amount of time is doing this, and then X percentage of time is doing that, you know, you don't sit there and think, right, it's now 4:45, I must, you know, get off this paper that I'm writing, and now I have to do this because 25% of my time is whatever. Just real work life just kind of doesn't work like that. So I think the funding issue would definitely be a big question mark, because, yeah, would funders really want to fund the teaching? Is that sort of in their interests, or what they're aiming to achieve from giving you the funding? But also just real life just means that, yeah, you might have some time for research in your contract, but when are you realistically going to do that when you're already working till, you know, late in the evening on the teaching stuff? You know, that balance just, I think in practice, just isn't going to materialize.
Do we all agree that some of the skills, that sometimes being forced to do something you don't really want to do, that you do become better from it? There are certain things in my job that I would never do if they were optional, but I value afterwards, that being forced to do them has made me better. Finance is one. I would rather not go anywhere near finance or admin or anything else, but I'm forced to do it because it's just me. But I kind of appreciate it now. I kind of go, okay, I've learned a new skill there that's useful. If you give me the choice to do it, though, I would have said, no, I don't want to do that. Do we need that push? Could forcing this even on a small scale just actually push, does having a teaching skill to prepare a lesson, to deliver that lecture, to answer questions, to engage with that community, could that make people better? Do you think you could be a better researcher because you could do that? Sara?
I think this is a very careful line to toe, Adam. Because if you force someone to do something, yes, I absolutely do think that, especially if there's quality control involved in it, that people will sort of try to give their best. They don't want to lose their job over this. They will try their best to, teach as best as possible. But forcing someone to do something that they hate could be very dangerous for actually pushing them out of being interested in really doing the job. And I think that a lot of the PhD experience for me, for example, has been doing stuff that I would never have chosen to do had I known. Had someone sat me down and said, these are the things you have to do for your PhD, I probably would have said, no, thank you, actually. But I really appreciate that I've been able to use this time as a PhD student to learn about those things that I don't enjoy and develop the skills so that if I do decide to go into a career that has those skills as a requirement, great, I fit the bill for it. But white knuckling something that you really hate could become a bit of a problem, could cause a little bit of burnout for people who are already quite close to burnout most of the time. And I would very much prefer that teachers are motivated, because having taught classes that I was motivated for was wonderful. But if I had to go and teach something on MRI physics today, I would not be very happy about it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no toxic work environments, Adam, where
No,
people get
thanks.
forced to do things that they don't want to do. We don't need
Wonderful.
any more toxicity. No.
I would be very interested if anybody's watching this on recorded, or if you're live in the audience now and you're watching this, and teaching is a mandatory expectation of being a postdoc in the country where you work. I'd like to know what that is, because I can't help but think that there's something cultural about this as well, that in this country postdocs aren't required to do teaching, or even maybe in certain institutions they are, and you kind of, if you knew in advance that that was the case, you had a choice. You could have gone, well, I don't want to work there, or that's not what I want to do. But you needed to know up front that that was part of it. It's kind of like, but in other parts of the world, where is it? You can't suddenly change the situation on people. I'd like to know if people like it, and if what kind of impact that has on people's motivations to pursue that career, if they knew that teaching was part of working at what is an academic learning institution. That's enough of our chat. We do have a few questions and points to raise. So let's take our first one, which Mia makes a point. Maybe opening new fields for postdocs where teaching is a must could help, not force current postdocs who want to be obliged to it, but while simultaneously attracting the right pool for the right audience. I completely agree with you there, Amia. Maybe there's different contract types, some of which give people an option. Hey, do you want to? It's funny. What I find with this is quite often the more senior you become, we'll come back to you, Rachel, in 10 years' time, when you're a professor, because quite often at that point, we did a podcast series called Ask Your Mentor, and it was mentees interviewing their mentors. Some of them were quite junior people still, but some of the mentors were had reached professor stage. And when you asked them what still excited them, what motivated them about their job, it was never the grants, it was never the papers. At that point, it was supervising PhD students through to completion and seeing the next generation. And that's what they really liked about their job now. Not the papers, not the grants, not even the research so much anymore, but actually bringing on the next generation. But I think there's probably a point in your career where that motivation takes over. So maybe actually it shouldn't be we should force postdocs to do teaching. We should be requiring everybody more senior to do that. I remember years ago having the hospital at night scheme saying, well, why aren't consultant, the most senior doctors, the ones that do the 80% of the work's done by the most junior of doctors, where the most senior of ones only come in at a certain stage. That actually we ought to flip that on its head. The more experienced people should do more. Anyway, we've got another point here, which is I'm fascinated to know how you think this is going to change with the rise of AI. That's a good question. Do we even need teachers anymore? Can't we just feed in, every lecture that happened during the pandemic was all streamed online, recorded, everything anybody ever said for 2 years is available. YouTube already has all the answers. Why don't we just feed YouTube into it and say, YouTube, teach my students?
Because YouTube isn't necessarily right, Alan. It might be.
Are the lecturers right?
It might be fun. It might take up your time doom scrolling. I think it has a place, and I think we have to embrace technology as it develops and changes, because that can really help enable learning. And but I think you're never going to replace that human interaction and how we learn from each other as people. So that's how I would address that. Yeah, there's definitely potential and things will change. But yeah, unless we have some sort of dystopian Terminator situation going on, we're always going to need people as part of that process.
In which case, why even go for the teaching? We'll just have it programmed straight into your brain. It's like a new app. We'll just put a new app in you. I'll have the maths app, please. Upload me the maths app, and there you go. I can do maths now. Do me the finance app that I don't like to have to do. We do have a couple of serious questions as well. So could mandatory teaching help build a more inclusive academic environment by bringing more diverse voices into the classroom? I tend to think it possibly could with that. I don't know. I don't have any evidence to back this up, but I think if we were to poll who are the people who are naturally drawn to those teaching positions, we might find that if we drew on that more researcher pool, we might get more diverse cultural backgrounds, people from different ethnicities, different backgrounds, different countries teaching. I don't know. What do you think, right, Sara?
It's an interesting one. I definitely think, again, this is very culture dependent, very university dependent. I think there might be better ways for us to bring in diverse teaching experiences without forcing. I think something that I have noticed during my job search of late is that one thing that many universities are doing here is when they're looking, for example, for coordinators for a large cohort for an aging study, instead of just hiring a few people, they are actually hiring for the different populations that we have within New Zealand. And I think that could be perhaps a little bit more of an approach that we could take with teaching. Like if we are creating a course on Alzheimer's disease in a population that is specific to the country, having a more diverse group of voices to come in to deliver specific lectures could be maybe a better approach than just saying, oh, we're going to make you all do it. And we already know that we've got different biases within academia already. So are we really drawing in a diverse population if the population that we have within academia isn't as diverse as we would like it to be already? So systemic change, here we go.
Okay, we're going to have 1 minute of closing arguments. I've just posted the closing poll into the chat, so I would encourage everybody watching to tell us what you think now. You've heard arguments for teaching being mandatory from Sara. We've heard the arguments why that absolutely shouldn't be the case from Rachel. And I'd love to know, at the start of our poll today, if I remember rightly, we had 20% agreed that teaching should, 20% disagreed, and 60% of you were undecided. So now please do go and vote in our closing poll. The link is in the chat. Please do tell us what you think now. And Sara, I will come to you first of all to make your closing argument.
Hard to make a closing argument now, isn't it? Okay, as my closing argument, I'd like the wording of this debate to be adjusted somewhat. I do think that in postdoctoral roles, it's very important for us to be mindful of the fact that we will be in teaching or teaching adjacent spaces, that we will be advisors and we will be mentors to people who are in an earlier career stage than us. And so I think that using that opportunity, treating it as teaching and trying to make the best of it so that we can help our younger students or our newer students and our ECRs to get involved in research. I think it's a wonderful opportunity, a wonderful way for us to develop some communication and leadership skills. And yeah, basically it shouldn't be mandatory, but it should be baked into the way that we work as postdoctoral researchers.
Thank you very much. And Rachel, your closing arguments.
I agree with Sara. I think if we rephrase this, should universities make teaching an opportunity as part of postdocs so that every postdoc would have opportunity to try that if that's something that they hadn't yet had experience of? I think I would be much more comfortable with that. I think it's making it a requirement and mandatory for all postdocs is where I would take issue, because there I think you've got some real inequalities and some real practical issues that you just can't overcome. And I think that would be really doing a disservice both to the individuals in postdocs and to academia in general. We want a diverse, happy, well-balanced academic workforce of the future, and we're not going to get that by making mandatory requirements on postdocs.
Thank you very much. So just final reminder to everybody, you can vote in the closing poll. We've got a point there from Mia's made another point about their experience of using language models in teaching. So I'll leave you to read that on the screen there. And yes, I agree. We did actually have a debate on AI earlier this in this season, but maybe we should come back with that in the new year. So while you're voting in your closing poll, I'm just going to remind you, we have one very last debate left in 2025, but it's a slightly more fun one. So next week on Wednesday, the 17th of December at 12 noon lunchtime, GMT UK time, we're going to have a debate around would Santa Claus make a good PI? This is a fun debate. We have Connor Richardson arguing against Santa Claus. We have Rebecca Williams arguing for Santa Claus as a PI, and Anna Volkmer and myself are going to host this one. It's a charity one where tickets are going to be sold rather than you can't attend for free, but all the money we get for tickets. So even if you can make it or you can't make it, buy a ticket anyway, because the money's just going to Dementia UK and their Admiral Nurse program, who provide fantastic support for families living with dementia, which is particularly essential at this time of year at Christmas. So I know I'm sure they'll really appreciate it. So please do buy a ticket for that, and we'll find out. I mean, the arguments are really strong. I mean, he's a good at meeting deadlines, right? I mean, work-life balance maybe gets a little bit off in December, and his EDI hiring, I'm not sure if he's good on EDI. He only hires elves, which doesn't seem very diverse. GDPR could be an issue because he does, watch you all the time. I mean, nobody wants a PI that's always watching you, right? But that's enough from that. Do join us next week for that salon debate, and please do buy a ticket. In the meantime, let's go and see what our exit poll has decided for this evening. And I'm going to share my screen now with the closing poll results. And here we are. So, at the start of today, it was very mixed, with 20% agreeing with the House, 20% disagreeing with the House, 60% being undecided. Our exit poll today says that 75% disagree with the House, 25% agree, which means that, Rachel, congratulations, you've made a good argument against the House to suggest that teaching shouldn't be mandatory for postdocs. As ever, as you've both said this evening, I think it's a bit of a simplistic view, isn't it, to say this? And I think both of you have actually shifted view. Sara, I think you were persuaded by Rachel's arguments as well. And I think we've all agreed instead that actually maybe a little bit more flexibility to allow those that do want to do teaching, that they can. That's not just something that my supervisor says I'm not allowed to teach, that maybe we should build in more systems for those that do. So there we are. Another debate comes to a close, and what a journey it's been. We set out with a simple question about teaching and postdocs, but as always, there's a real story revealed itself in the layers beneath, between ambition and support and identity and pressure, family life and purpose, and all those things that shape these quiet corners in academic life. Our speakers gave two very different versions, even though they were persuaded by each other in the end. So not whether teaching should be required, but how we maybe build a culture where a research culture that supports people to become teachers if they choose to. So thank you very much to Rachel, Dr. Rachel Allen, and the incredible Sara Zsadanyi for joining us this evening for our 9th debate of the season. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week for finding out if Santa is a good PI. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Fun. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Sara.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.